Greetings, everyone. Oh, I think I just bumped into one of your friends. Hello. Well, today we're going to continue our journey through the Universal Monsters collection with The Mummy from 1932. Yeah, so as I mentioned in the Old Dark House review the other day, 1932 was a pretty significant year for Boris Karloff. His star was very much on the rise. With the, Frankenstein being such a massive hit the year before. So much so that while in Frankenstein, he didn't actually get any upfront billing, he was just billed as the monster in the end credits. In The Mummy, he had marquee value, so he was billed not just as Boris Karloff, but as Karloff, the Uncanny. Yeah, so he was already becoming a superstar like barely a year after Frankenstein. So The Mummy was the first in a series of 5 Mummy films, the latter 4 of which had nothing to do with this one. They actually kind of became their own thing afterwards. So today we're going to talk about the first one from 1932, The Mummy, starring Karloff the Uncanny, today on the Halloween Horror Reviews on Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. I'm just going to pop this off here. So, The Mummy kind of stands alone in the initial 3 big Universal Monsters movies, because of course Dracula and Frankenstein were both based on novels, whereas The Mummy actually didn't have any existing story to draw upon. No, it's actually the producers were kind of taken by the opening of King Tut's tomb 10 years earlier in 1922, and thought, there might be a horror story potential there, especially with the whole idea of there being a curse on the tomb for anyone who dares to open it. So they developed essentially an original story around the whole idea of a mummy being discovered and there being a curse and the ensuing horror that results. So the story opens in 1921 with an expedition in Cairo to unearth anything interesting essentially for the museum, and they've discovered an ancient mummy. Now the interesting thing about this mummy, however, is it's not like regular mummies where the internal organs have been removed. All the internal organs are intact, and they quickly ascertain that this particular mummy was actually buried alive. And in examining the sarcophagus, they actually see that there's been a lot of hieroglyphics scratched off from the inside of the sarcophagus, specifically ones pertaining to the spirit of the buried person being protected in the underworld. So this is someone who was buried alive because they had committed some kind of indiscretion or blasphemy or something. They don't know the specifics of it, just know that he did something wrong and this was his punishment for it. And they determined that the name of the mummy is Imhotep. Now, interestingly enough, there was a real-life Imhotep back in ancient Egypt, but he did not die in disgrace. Far from it, in fact. He was actually one of the original architects of the pyramids, and is notable in that apparently he was the only non-pharaoh to ascend to godhood. So the real-life Imhotep was actually a pretty big deal. So along with the mummy, they've also discovered a strange casket, a box of some kind. And they open it up and they see there's a box within the box. So they take a look at that, and it's very ornate and has some writing on the top of it. So they read the writing on the top, and there's the curse. Basically, anybody who opens this casket will, suffer the curse, blah, blah, blah. And they suspect that this casket may actually contain the Scroll of Thoth, which is an ancient scroll long thought to be lost, which contains hieroglyphics and spells to raise the dead. So Sir Joseph Wemple, who is heading up the expedition, and Dr. Muller, who's an expert in Egyptology, played by Edward Van Sloan, by the way, in a role not very far removed from Van Helsing that he played the previous year in Dracula, they go outside to kind of discuss the situation and what they should do with these finds. They're particularly concerned with the Scroll of Thoth. Meanwhile, their assistant, a young explorer who's just kind of getting his feet wet in archaeology, decides to take it upon himself to open the casket. So he opens the casket, and sure enough, the Scroll of Thoth is inside. He unrolls the scroll and begins to read the hieroglyphics, muttering quietly to himself as he's reading them and trying to translate them. Meanwhile, behind him, in the sarcophagus containing the mummy, which is stood up against the wall, the mummy's eyes slowly begin to open, and his hands begin to move. For unbeknownst to the hapless assistant, he's actually reading the spell that resurrects the dead. So the mummy comes to life and slowly approaches the table and puts his hand on the scroll. The assistant sees him and almost immediately goes insane with terror and just starts laughing uncontrollably. The mummy takes the scroll and walks out the door. The other two come rushing in, hearing him laughing and freaking out. They see that the casket's open, the scroll is gone, the mummy's gone. What happened? And all he can say is, "He went for a walk! He went for a walk!" And he just starts laughing and laughing and laughing. And that's where the beginning of the movie ends. So we fast forward to 11 years later, 1932. There's another expedition around the same place where they discovered Imhotep. For the longest time, they've had no idea what happened to the mummy. They just assumed that it had been stolen. So this is another expedition headed up by Sir Joseph Wemple and ably assisted by his son Frank. And they're about to pack it in. They haven't really found anything of any interest. And then this mysterious man shows up who introduces himself as Ardeth Bey and says that he's found something near their dig site that may be of interest to them. And what it is it's a little piece of pottery with some hieroglyphics on it. And he says it's the tomb of a woman named Ankhsenamen. And he's very mysterious about how he knew the location of this tomb. He just kind of directs them to where to dig. And they start digging, and sure enough, there's a tomb down there. And they unearth it, and they find a mummy in there, who is the mummy of a young woman. And it's a huge, major find. So they cart everything back to the museum in Cairo. They're not allowed to take it back to England with them. It's something to do with their arrangement there, but they're allowed to study everything there in Cairo. So they all kind of set up shop in Cairo to study the mummy and the various findings, and they have a big show displaying everything, and it's all very exciting. So one night, after the museum closes, Ardeth Bey makes his way inside, and he's quite taken with this female mummy. It's almost as if he knows who it is, like if he recognizes her. So he sets up a candle on the floor next to the casket and unrolls a scroll, and it's the Scroll of Thoth. And he starts murmuring the same spell that brought the mummy to life 11 years earlier, presumably trying to bring Ankhsenamen back to life. So that same night, there's a party being hosted by Sir Joseph Wemple and Dr. Muller. At this party is also Dr. Muller's daughter, Helen Grosvenor, played by the absolutely beautiful and just wonderfully talented Zita Johann, who apparently was treated very, very poorly by Karl Freund, the director of the film. There's a number of stories about all kinds of horrible things that he did to her while she was there. They just did not get along at all. And she was a very strong-willed, headstrong woman who really did not take crap from anybody. So all of his attempts to kind of make things miserable for her tended to backfire on him. But unfortunately, it also kind of soured her view of Hollywood, and she didn't make too many films after that. Her entire IMDb page is 8 movies. So yeah, it's unfortunate because I have to say her performance in this was fantastic. I mean, she was so beautiful and really poured herself into this role. So anyway, at this party, Helen is compelled to leave for some reason, and she doesn't understand why. It's almost as if she's in a trance, and she takes a taxi and makes her way to the museum, and she's trying to get in to the museum. Meanwhile, in the museum, Ardeth Bey is chanting this spell of awakening the dead, and he keeps saying the name Anxanamen, Anxanamen, over and over again. And as he's chanting this name, Helen is simultaneously trying to get into the museum. Meanwhile, Frank and Dr. Muller show up and find Helen, and she kind of snaps out of it, and she's like, what's going on? And they bring her back to their place to look after her, and she doesn't have any recollection of why she went to the museum or anything like that. So as the story unfolds, it becomes very clear that Helen is in fact the reincarnation of Anxanamen, and that's why she has that connection. So whenever Ardith Bey is trying to resurrect or summon Anxanamen, she responds to it. Ardith Bey eventually discovers that Helen is in fact the reincarnation of Anxanamen, and tries to convince her to go with him to basically let him kill her to be reincarnated in the flesh as Anxanamen, and they can be together. So, in case you haven't guessed, Ardith Bey is in fact Imhotep in disguise. He's actually been resurrected as a living mummy, essentially. So, while he's not still all bandaged up and everything, he has the appearance of a very aged man. So, another interesting thing about Zita Johann is she was actually a firm believer in reincarnation and the supernatural. She would pray before every take, like just to kind of get in the right headspace and such. And this character and this story was something that resonated very strongly with her beliefs, which I think is one of the reasons why her performance in this is so darned compelling, because she really believes in all this stuff and poured all of that into her character, and it really shows. I mean, it's a very strong performance, and it's, you know, as I say, a real shame that she didn't do more movies, because she could have been massive. But, well, the few we've got, at least, we can enjoy her in. And Boris Karloff, I think this was the first movie where he really had a significant speaking role. And he has such a wonderful speaking voice. In fact, he would later go on to host shows and narrate shows. Many of you probably know him as the narrator and voice of the Grinch in How the Grinch Stole Christmas. But just a wonderful voice. And as Ardith Bey, he is so compelling and so haunting. The way he moves, the way he speaks, the way he just stares unblinking at whoever he's talking to, it's completely entrancing. Like, you can't take your eyes off him. You're completely compelled to listen to every single word, and it's just amazing to see. I mean, there's no wonder why he became such a massive star. He had just such an incredible screen presence. And the thing that makes it interesting is the performance as Ardith Bey is so minimal. Like, it's very slow, very deliberate, very calculated in terms of how the character interacts with the other characters. But you can't take your eyes off him. He's just so darn compelling. Now, it's interesting because they made such a big deal about the curse at the beginning, but they don't really get into much curse stuff. You always hear about the mummy's curse and whatnot, but they really didn't do much with that. Where people end up getting killed or harmed as a result of interacting with this whole scenario is through the direct actions of Ardith Bey. He has his own home where he's got a manservant there, and in the main chamber of the home, he's got it all decked out like ancient Egypt, and he has this pool of water that he can look into and see whoever he wants to see what they're doing and so forth, and he can directly affect them as well. For example, there's a scene where Sir Joseph Wemple, at the behest of Dr. Muller, decides that the best course of action is to destroy the Scroll of Thoth. So at this point, they've managed to recover the scroll, and they decide that destroying it is the best course of action so that they can destroy Ardith Bey. Basically, it's what's keeping him alive. So they destroy the scroll, they destroy him and his power, and Helen will be free. So Sir Joseph Wemple goes to burn the scroll. He throws it in the fire, and Ardith Bey is watching him through the pool. And as he's watching, he has this ring that's kind of like the focal point of his power. he reaches towards the pool and starts chanting this thing. He says like Kebet, Keb, Kebet, Keb, Kebet, which, by the way, is actual Egyptian for destruction. It's apparently a reference to some chant that is all about destruction and, you know, the goddess and things like that. But so he just kind of chants the destruction part of it. So anyway, he's reaching, and he reaches, and he just kind of turns his hand like a fist. And as he's doing that, Sir Joseph Wemple is clutching his chest, like he starts to have a heart attack, and he can't stop it. And it's literally, I love like the back and forth between Sir Joseph Wemple clutching his chest and trying to burn the scroll, and Ardith Bey and just his slow, deliberate crushing of the man's life. Like, you literally get the feeling of him just crushing the life out of him with his hand, and it's terrifying. It's a very powerful scene. And he does that a couple of times. In another scene, he tries to do it to Frank, the young man. Now, Frank has been given a charm very similar to the whole crucifix protecting you from vampires idea, but in this case, I think it was a charm of Anubis with an ankh, and he was wearing it, and it was protecting him, but then at one point he decides to take it off and put it around the doorknob to Helen's room to protect her. And the second he does that, it's like Ardith Bey was watching the whole damn time, and as soon as he takes the charm off, he is immediately, Keb Kebet, Keb Kebet, and it's like, oh crap, now Frank's gonna die. So, but Frank, I guess, is young and strong, so he has a mild heart attack, but doesn't die. He manages to survive. But yeah, every time I watch this movie, I'm reminded of just how damn good it is. It's interesting because in terms of the structure of the story, it has a lot of similarities to Dracula from the year before. In fact, there's some scenes that are almost beat for beat exactly right out of Dracula. Like there's a scene where Dr. Muller, as I mentioned, played by Edward Van Sloan, confronts Ardith Bey, and it's very reminiscent of the scene in Dracula where Van Helsing confronts Dracula and sort of reveals that he knows who he is and what's going on. It's the same, almost the same scene. Almost the dialogue's almost the same as well. It's just they've transposed talking about mummies for talking about vampires. You know, I don't know. I mean, a lot of people seem to focus on those similarities, but the overall story is quite different. And getting into the whole reincarnated lover storyline, that, of course, is something that was later incorporated into Dracula movies. I talked about this a little bit when I was talking about the 1974 version of Dracula, the one starring Jack Palance, and how that was the first Dracula movie to incorporate that type of storyline. But honestly, I mean, this is the first time I can recall that was in a monster movie where it was a reincarnated lover. So it's kind of interesting. Like the Mummy parallels Dracula in some ways, and then Dracula later borrowed elements from the Mummy to put the reincarnated lover story. Although actually that one was borrowing elements from Dark Shadows, but that's a whole other thing. Go watch that review if you want that sort of connection. But yeah, overall, I love this movie. I think it's fantastic. The makeup is absolutely amazing. I think it's one of Jack Pierce's finest creations. Absolutely amazing. Like just when Boris Karloff is made up in full mummy costume, apparently it was so thick that he couldn't actually speak at all. Like it just completely solidified his face. And the scene where he takes the scroll in full mummy outfit, he was actually in full mummy costume from head to foot, yet in that scene you only see his hand taking the scroll. You never actually see him fully head to foot, other than when he's standing still in the sarcophagus, and then you just see like a couple of the bandages dragging away as he's walking out of the room, and that's it. So you never actually get he did it. Like he was in full mummy costume and walked around and stuff for that scene, but you never see it in the movie. I don't even know if they actually filmed any full body shots of that. If they did, they don't exist anymore, obviously. And even when he's Ardith Bey, he's made up to look old and wrinkled. So the texture of the skin, and this is something you really see on the Blu-ray, is just all of the beautiful texture of that makeup. It's just fantastic. So Yeah, I mean, Jack Pierce was very rapidly honing his craft over the course of these monster movies, and it would only get better and better. It's really quite impressive. And there you have it. So, yeah, definitely a worthy entry in the early days of the Universal Monsters universe, and one I definitely enjoy revisiting time and time again. Alrighty, that is it from me to you for now, so I'll see you again next time. Until then, thanks for watching. Big thanks to my Patreon sponsors, and sayonara.